This is Rockin HIT Sales, a quick podcast built around the buyer side realities of healthcare. I'm David Hacker, your host and founder of Elevate HIT Sales. In each episode, I sit down with health system and health IT leaders to unpack what actually gets initiatives approved, implemented, and scaled. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Yasir Tarabichi, head of Digital and CMIO at Ovatient, a MetroHealth venture, and Chief Health AI Officer at MetroHealth. This conversation is about AI governance in the real world, how health systems evaluate AI enabled tools, what vendors need to understand before provider review, and why responsible AI adoption requires more than a strong demo or technical claim. Dr. Parabici, thank you. Welcome to Rockin HIT Sales. I really do appreciate you joining me today to help our listeners better understand how health systems think about AI governance, responsible adoption, and what vendors really need to know to prepare before they bring an AI-enabled tool into a provider environment.
Thanks for having me.
Your roles span digital health, clinical informatics, Ovation, and MetroHealth's AI strategy. How do you describe your role in the AI governance conversation?
Sure. The common theme, I think, in a lot of that portfolio of responsibility that I've built is digital transformation, and I would probably put a fine point on responsible digital transformation. And so I lead the organization's health AI strategy, our governance structures, and on the startup side, I'm also part of a virtual care startup called Ovatient, where we are bringing a solution built on Epic to enhance virtual care options within our customer sites. So it's a single platform, several states, integrated into other platforms so that patients get contiguous care regardless of where they are, and information and orders and expectations are being kind of shuttled across the organizations in a meaningful way. So patients, as far as they're concerned, it's all one system. And so I do a lot of work in interoperability. I do a lot of work in the governance space, bringing different groups together towards a common goal.
Now, when the term AI governance, which is used fairly often, what does that mean in actual practical terms inside the four walls of a health system?
It depends on who you're talking to. My definition really, I like to think of it as a way of working, or if you, a little bit on the nose here, but an operating system. And so it's deciding how we're going to approach this technology from a digital transformation perspective. And a lot of it comes down to clear expectations, accountability, and transparency, right, for the organization. And so when I think about a really good AI governance structure, I expect that everybody in the organization knows what we're trying to do, where we're headed, how we're going to get there, and who's responsible for what. And we're doing this at scale, and we're doing this in really a resource constrained setting where people understand where their contributions are, what they can and can't or should do, really.
Now, why has AI governance became so urgent now compared to, traditional digital health and or clinical decision supports oversight?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating acceleration. I'll just say that it's kind of the unlock that we've been looking for in a lot of the spaces you mentioned, right? So think about clinical decision support. We used to run it in this kind of serial process. We did a lot of waterfall development, right, in healthcare systems, where we went through, developed this at the point of care, decided how it was going to work, what the population looked like, what the expectations looked like. And we built more and more solutions on top of our electronic health record in a way where, I think it was a slow process, but it did inevitably and ultimately become a little onerous to manage and maintain. AI has come along to, I think, unlock and scale that problem faster. And so we've realized all of the same problems we've been struggling with before have now basically just scaled up. And so, where the generative solutions come into play outside of the predictive analytics that we've been doing for decades, it's the ability to manipulate and understand the data, take advantage of that data that's locked away in the EHR in a much more fluid fashion. And I think a lot of the development that's come on the heels of this AI healthcare revolution, if you will, really pushes us to be much more agile in our development process. And so it's kind of evolved the need to be quick. It's evolved the need to be resourceful in this space, even though a lot of the problems that we're trying to solve are the same problems we've been trying to solve for over a decade now. I just think it's just a matter of a confluence of timing, frankly. And these are things that we've been doing. We just need to keep doing, and we need to do better and faster.
So, what does the front door for an AI product look like in a health system? How does an idea, internal use case, or vendor solution, how does that enter that process?
Highly variably, but that's been an issue that we've been trying to clamp down on. So I'll just say kind of our evolution is we always led with the problems we were trying to solve. A lot of early AI initiatives came out of quick your wheels, folks who higher up in the organization that were, very engaged, thought that a product could be useful. And it was us as an organization dipping our toes in the solution space. So, hey, we need to understand how to do Gen AI. Well, here's a great tool that helps us summarize patients' charts. We need to understand how to do conversational agents. Well, here's a voice solution for a very specific patient situation. So we were starting to get to understand the technology and know the technology. Now, obviously, we've realized, and I'd say most organizations have passed this point as well, we need to take 17 steps back and think about our overall strategy from a higher vantage point. Think about how we structure the responsibility and compliance aspect of the solutions that we're thinking about. And then think about how we bring all the right people to the larger table. And so, what that culminates in is making sure we have people from all aspects of the organization that have an insight into their subject matter expertise, but also an understanding of what AI can unlock potentially to get us to a point where we can bring this kind of 3-bucket ecosystem, if you will, into play so that everyone's thinking about AI and everyone's thinking about what we need to do in this space. Now, part of that kind of 3-bucket strategy is we've pulled steering and strategy back into a separate group. And that steering and strategy group, their obsession is what should the organization be thinking about in the next 6, 12, 18 months? What are the things that we need to be investing in? How are we upskilling our workforce? What are the solutions we want? So more of a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach of, I saw a thing. Somebody approached me with a very compelling product. We're obviously drowning in executives that have seen very compelling products, but we need to bring that all together, right? So the higher level steering committee talks about the direction, talks about what are the solutions we would like to pursue, either through an RFP or potentially build, right? Given the right tools or solutions. And how can we get our folks to a point where they can either build or co-develop some of these solutions? And that's now separating from the responsible AI kind of oversight group. That acts more like an IRB. So from the research perspective, if you think about that, it sets the expectations at the organizational level for what we consider reasonable risk, high, moderate, low risk, what we think is kind of portfolio concordant as far as solutions go, what makes sense for us as an organization, and what are the things we need to do to monitor and mitigate risk when we implement these solutions. So that group sets up the expectations, and then our kind of operating groups, the subject matter experts, use that guidance and rubric to think about solutions that they want to bring to bear. And when it touches their area of work and they understand it and they know it, we as an organization higher up don't necessarily need to be involved in that, as long as, again, they're following the rules of the road when it comes to our overall AI portfolio. And so what that kind of starts to develop, if you will, if you kind of think about it, is an opportunity to say there's a kind of a top-down strategy for expensive, high-level things that we need to worry about, expectations that the organization has for growth in the space, infrastructure, education, things that we care about at large. And then there's a kind of bottom-up opportunity to say, you're a radiologist. While I am Chief Health AI Officer, I don't, I'm a pulmonary and critical care doc. I don't necessarily live in your radiology workflows. You need to tell me what's important. And better yet, if it's a reasonable thing to do within the guardrails that we've determined or established, then just go do it, right? Don't wait for an approval. So the triage aspect kind of splits into, is this a reasonable thing for the organization? Is it consistent with our overall goals and portfolio? Do we have a solution that already does this? And if the answer is check marks on all of the above, then it's a matter of when and what's the prioritization for the level of organization. And that's where the steering committee comes into play and says, this seems great, very niche, but it's going to steal away 50% of our resources for 2 years, and we can't afford that because we have these other bigger issues we need to solve first. Or maybe we need to think about bringing in additional help, right? Third parties, or even hiring more staff. So that kind of orchestration at a higher level is happening at the steering committee profile. And so kind of thinking about how that all comes together, a solution enters a system based on where it is on that scale. An enterprise-wide solution with a lot of potential impact up and down is going to have to enter at a higher level. It's going to have to be considered a higher level. A lower risk solution that solves a specific pain point or a problem, especially if it's inexpensive and reasonable within our tech stack and kind of our current agreements, is not going to meet a lot of resistance. It's going to be reviewed for responsibility, reliability. As long as it's got a good monitoring and mitigation plan, it's not going to have an issue. That's the long-winded answer. How do solutions land in our laps?
There's a lot of different moving parts that my listeners really need to pay attention to, is depending upon where they fit, where they would fall into walking through that front door. And the next question has to do with, how do you balance that innovation need for speed versus the need for discipline, safety, and operational control?
It's all about the risk. As soon as an application or a solution makes its way into our system, again, depending on where it sits at the operational level, or if it needs to be escalated to the kind of the strategy steering group, an assessment is made as to the risks associated with this intervention. So, for example, if this is a back office solution that automates something that is fairly deterministic and is of low potential risk for the organization, legal, compliance, patient, assuming the money's there and someone's willing to pay for it, right? It's not going to be an issue, especially if it fits within our overall portfolio and expectations, or our plan, if you will, our roadmap. Anything that touches patient care, that interfaces with patients, right? That helps assist with clinical decision making, that comes with any legal risk, for instance. I mean, that includes HR systems, for example. That's going to be flagged for a full review. And that full review is going to be a responsible AI advisory committee review. So they're going to step through it. We have a series of intake processes. And it's also going to be reviewed at the higher executive level through that steering committee. And the expectation is we try not to say no. It's not often we say no. It's usually potentially or yes, but. And that's where the burden falls back on the developer, the vendor, right? To start explaining why and how they've mitigated this risk, why this isn't as bad as we think it is, and how they would potentially enhance or change or monitor going forward to try to reassure us about the risks involved in that solution. And so the level of attention that anything gets is kind of a combination of cost, implementation cost, and also potentially risk to the organization.
And as you go through, and as you mentioned, there may be vendors that yes, but is there anything that you've seen that vendors underestimate, or kind of a continuing thing that vendors, they seem to miss this one particular step or this one particular item, be it security, privacy, integration, or clinical risk?
Yeah.
Is there anything in particular that stands out to you?
Yeah. I'll just say that most vendors have figured out security and privacy. We're past that point, right? So if you fail out at security and privacy, if you don't know that, our data being placed in a large language model risks, and training that large language model risks our patient data, then we have an issue. Or if you oversimplify privacy and you say, I'm just going to scrub a couple of PHI identifiers, and therefore you don't have HIPAA anymore, then you don't understand how the confluence of data can actually help, can be used to re-identify patients. So that happens sparingly. That's usually someone who's not developed in healthcare before, stepping into healthcare, right? MLOps, but not healthcare native. That's kind of a rookie mistake. I think I'm going to flip the question and I'm going to say, what are the signs of maturity that I've seen from vendors? Because I think that's a different way to think about it. The vendors that come to us with clarity with regards to the problem they're solving and how it affects us as an organization. But even beyond that, understand the lift involved in implementing and meaningfully and responsibly implementing their solution and show us not only historically that their solution can make a difference, but show us how they're going to show us when we implement the solution, how they are making a difference, how we're monitoring, how are we identifying risk, and do we have a plan and a pathway for mitigating that risk? We've noticed, for instance, a drop off in the accuracy for certain, demographics or subgroups in your patient population, and we are going to respond to that. And this is how we typically would respond to that. That is a level of maturity that always impresses me. And we've worked with vendors who have done this. And so that level of insight into, the model's fine, the solution's nifty, but our niche is change management and really operationalizing this solution. Like, we can get this into your system and we can make a difference. And we are hand in hand doing this together. That is that's a phenomenal relationship. And that's not always the relationship we'll get, right? People often get stuck at I built a really impressive model, and that's just the beginning of the journey. I often say it's not the size of the AUC that matters, it's how you use it, right? It's really that basic of a concept. And in healthcare, that's crucial. So not only does that level of planning and insight reassure us, but I think it starts to build trust early in that vendor relationship. So if you've come to me and you say, I have a plan, and here's how I've done this, and here's how I would do it, I sleep better at night as the system's chief health AI officer, because really my whole job is monitoring and mitigating risk. Everybody wants to turn everything on, but who's watching it for when it goes wrong, and who's watching it for any potential harm or disparities it may be causing in our patients? Bring me a vendor that understands that and says, here's how we're going to monitor and mitigate that. Then we're going to have a good conversation.
And that was actually part of my next question, is who's actually monitoring that AI to make sure there isn't drift? And, has there ever been a situation, or do you have any policies where an AI product needs to be taken a step backwards until there's some things that get
Yeah.
resolved?
Yes, it's happened before. So, we want to see a little bit of that sausage making. And so, for instance, we've had a vendor develop a model to predict the patient's risk of readmission or unplanned admission. And some of the variables look directionally incoherent. And that gave us pause. We paused, we said we need to stop, we need to figure out what went on. We went back into the innards, figured out how the model was trained, started to understand why we were seeing the signal that we were seeing, and even made recommendations about how to develop a better solution. And so that level of give and take, again, as long as there's transparency and a true eagerness not to oversell, but to co-develop, is super important. I think that improves that level of trust. I think that shows some savvy and enhances that credibility. Like, I need to see that we're working on this together. Black boxes are not going to work. And there are definitely situations where we have a wealth of the data and we have to work together with the solution developer to marry the data together in a way where we can understand the impact. So some things are not necessarily immediately reportable from the vendor's perspective. And so we establish pipelines of data exchange, which obviously is work, for our data analysts and our data team, but we expect as much. And I think some of our most successful implementations really had data and dashboarding first, where we would start to see any good, bad, deviant signals early on in the process. And it was often a mashup of data that they'd bring to bear that we surface within our system, married to or matched to patient or workflow, so that we can actually kind of look at this together and make sense of the impact of the solution.
Now, from your opinion, at what point in the sales process should an AI-enabled IT company start addressing the AI readiness and governance expectations? Because oftentimes those early conversations are with operational clinical leaders who may not be deeply technical. So how should vendors explain their readiness, risk, and monitoring governance in a way that's credible for them, but not overwhelming to the team they're
Yeah.
speaking with?
Oh, I mean, this is a great question. I think it depends entirely on your audience. I'll give you the clinical example that I've run into. We have a solution. It can predict A, B, or C, right? It can scan an ultrasound of the heart and predict the likelihood of a certain cardiac condition. What I would love my head cardiologist or ultrasonographer, head of echocardiography imaging, to kind of think through is, how does this work for me, my patients, our population, and our workflow? And how are we different, right? As a safety net healthcare system, MetroHealth is very much different. And we often sit on the wrong side, if you will, of that validation expectation where there are assumptions made about a solution and how it does for our patient population. So we teach that. That's part of the upskilling. So when people come to us and say, we want to talk about some AI solutions, we explain about the things we care about as an organization, as a safety net system. And I've seen that work and I've seen that not work. So I've seen that work because they'll come up against a vendor and they'll say, what does this work? How does this work for my patients? And they'll have a conversation. And they'll say, well, we've run it on highly diverse demographics and we have a plan and a process, again, to how we would monitor your system. And I've seen it where the vendor goes, oh, don't worry about it, right? And so we like to place our responsible AI intake process as early on in the conversation as possible. One of the things that might come up is, we already have this, or we have it and it's actually better than what they're trying to tell you. And why don't you know that we have this, right? I mean, there are large organizational issues, and we come back to that definition of an operating system. We all need to understand what we're doing, what we have in the space. So bring to bear that transparency so people know, what do we have and what should we be asking if someone's trying to sell me something. It's crucial. And I think vendors, even if your end users don't ask this question, can still position themselves in a healthy way so that when the AI informed part of the organization catches wind of this conversation, it's clear at the outset that there is a consideration given to these matters. And so when my end user comes back and they say, oh, they've got the data and they're telling me this will work for all segments of our patient population and they're going to help us monitor to make sure that it does, that's a couple of sentences that are highly valuable, and at least motions to me that we are aligned on that expectation, that this is going to probably work out and we're going to be able to have this conversation. What I think doesn't always work is we'll send out material ahead of time for kind of an intake process. And I've had vendors just kind of like check the box and say, yeah, we do all this. And then we get into a conversation for that next step and they go, oh no, we don't actually do that. Right. So the kind of, do you check for bias? Of course we do. Well, what does that mean to you? Right. And how does that mean? Like, how does that carry over to us? And how can we trust that you're doing that? And we need to be able to look over your shoulder and see the work. It's so much more a conversation, and it's so much more a collaboration with these solutions than I would say prior, more static solutions, right? And it just feels different. I mean, I've been in informatics in clinical informatics for over a decade now, and I'll just say that the level of involvement required for any of these AI solutions is just much heftier than things that we've talked about in the past, for obvious reasons.
All right, so we've hit what I call the lightning rapids. Two very quick questions, very quick answers, the end of the session here. So the first question is, what should companies just stop saying or doing when they're talking to a health system about an AI solution?
Leading with the fact that it is an AI solution.
Now, complete this sentence for me, please. A healthcare AI company is not ready for a health system review until
it can explain how the solution will be implemented, monitored, and governed, not just how it performs.
Tarabichi, thank you so much for joining Rockin HIT Sales. This was, for me, very informative and fascinating, and it's also incredibly timely for the practical conversations in AI governance. I know our listeners are walking away with a much clearer picture and understanding of what AI-enabled health IT companies need to do to prepare before they go and sit in front of the providers, the evidence, the workflow, context, etc. So again, thank you for sharing your time and your perspective.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
As we wrap this episode on AI governance, let's review my 3 brief takeaways. Number 1, AI governance is an operating system, not just a committee. It defines expectations, accountability, transparency, and who is responsible for what across the organization. Number 2, risk determines the path through the front door. A low-risk back-office AI tool is going to be evaluated differently than anything that's touching patient care, clinical decision-making, legal exposure, or health system-wide resources. Number 3, health systems trust vendors who can explain implementation, monitoring, and governance. A strong model is just beginning. Vendors need to show how the solution will be deployed, monitored, measured, and governed in real workflow. Have questions, comments, or guest ideas? Email me at podcast@elevate-hit-sales.com. Music, as always, is courtesy of Pennsylvania's finest, the Badleys. And today, since I'm rocking Eric Clapton, remember, before you promise your AI will change the world, make sure it can get through the crossroads of implementation, monitoring, and governance. Otherwise, the health system may not think it's so wonderful tonight.